so many, he's such a picture of Jesus, of Christ. But then we see, I think I heard someplace that there's nothing said negative about Joseph in the Scripture. So he's just a wonderful example for us to look at, and we'll see how he ran into some pitfalls in his life and how he overcame those and how he avoided them. Today we'll be looking at the pitfall of betrayal. Betrayal is a kind of a nasty word. When I think probably all of us have experienced some type of betrayal in our lives where somebody has betrayed us, and that is a very hurtful instance, and it can be very harmful. Well, when you start thinking about it in the Bible, the word betrayal, obviously we think of Jesus and being betrayed by Judas, but there's other examples of betrayal, and that's what we'll be looking at here in the life of Joseph. The point of the lesson is God is at work even when it's not obvious, and just that point makes you think of Romans 8:28. So we know that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, those that are called according to His purpose. And that's a wonderful promise that we have. And there's a lot of times when things are working together, we have to believe it's for our good, but it's certainly not obvious. We could think of other ways for these things to happen, but most time, if we look back in our lives, we see how God can work even very difficult situations in our life for good. And it may not be, that situation may not be working necessarily for our own personal good, but it may be for somebody else's good, that in God's kingdom it works for good. So we have to take that all in perspective. Betrayal, this writer said, betrayal can only happen at the hand of someone we trust. And that makes it so painful. But it also, I think that since betrayal can only happen at the hand of someone we trust, it makes us somewhat, we're hindered, or we're reluctant to trust people. And that's one of the things I think that we see in our society today. There's a general lack of trust, and that makes it very difficult. On page 97, it says, trust is a valuable commodity, and it really stings when that trust disappears. And if you think about it, trust and betrayal are really polar opposites of each other. You cannot be betrayed by someone you do not trust. So that's kind of the opposite of that. And again, I think that really points to the difficulties or the reluctance that people have of trusting other people. Well, as I indicated, we're going to be looking at the life of Joseph. Now, Joseph, back last year, and I forget just exactly what month it was, we studied Abraham. We had, I think, a 6-session series of lessons on Abraham. Well, this is a nice follow-up to that, because Joseph ends up is the great-grandson of Abraham. So the setting will be starting in Genesis 37 today. And before this, Jacob's father Isaac had sent Jacob to his relatives in Padan Aram to find a wife. And Jacob travels up there and into the region of Haran. Now, Haran should ring a bell to you. If you remember when we studied Abraham and his brother and his father and Abraham and Sarah, his brother Nahor, his father, and Lot, they traveled from Ur up to Haran. And from Haran, they stayed there for some time. His father dies, Nahor stays there, Abraham, Sarah, and Lot go down to Canaan. So this is this land where Abraham at one time lived. It's where Abraham's brother Nahor lives. So Jacob goes up to Haran and he meets Rachel, which Rachel is, if you go through the lineage, you had Abraham's brother was Nahor. Nahor married Micah, and they have a son Bethuel, and that they have a daughter who's Rebekah, and that becomes Isaac's wife. This is Jacob's father. Now, Nahor then has the son Bethuel. He has a grandson Laban. Laban becomes is the father of Rachel and Leah. So this is all in a family. Rebekah is a first cousin, one time removed from Isaac, who she marries. Jacob ends up marrying. I forget. I think I figured this out. If I'm right, Jacob and Rachel, and as well as Leah, are second cousins, one time removed. So they're family. They're all kind of within the family. They're in the family of Abraham and Abraham's brother Nahor. So they end up. They go up there to get this. You recall Jacob marries. First of all, he's wanting to marry Rachel, but Laban ends up fooling him, and he ends up by mistake marries his sister, the older sister, Leah. Then he works another 10 years, marries Rachel, and in the meantime he has two other wives that are handmaidens of Rachel and Leah. So out of these 4 wives comes the 12 children of Jacob, or 12 children of Israel, and Joseph is one of those. So that's where we kind of pick up today's lesson. In chapter 34, it says, Jacob had lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. These are the two handmaidens of Rachel and Leah. And he brought a bad report about them to his father. Now, Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than the other sons because Joseph was born of him in his old age, and he made a long-sleeved robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peacefully to him. Then Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. So this is a situation. They lived in his land where his father had stayed or sojourned, as I think as King James says, had dwelt. It really emphasized this was a temporary residence in this land, that they had not really they had not taken full ownership of this land of Canaan. Then they start this family records, and it's curious, they begins highlighting Joseph. This is the first word that occurs, and it really highlights the importance of Joseph in this whole story. In fact, the chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis really focuses on how God used Joseph, and that's what we were looking at in these series of lessons. Well, Joseph at this time is at 17 years old. He's tending sheep with his brothers, and it's curious. He says he's working with these sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, and with the sons of them. Well, so I'm about to get my generations mixed up. Anyway, he's working with his relatives here. I forget, I think would be probably his cousins, but I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. But anyway, at any rate, Joseph ends up bringing a bad report about them. This is these brothers. He brings a bad report to his father. Now, it's curious. We don't know whether that bad report was true or not. We don't know what the essence of the report was, but it's obvious that it's something that the brothers did not want their Jacob to know about. And so Joseph ends up telling his father about this, and this certainly caused repercussions for the brothers, as well as this relationship between Joseph and his brothers. So, verse 3 particularly notes that Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than the other brothers. Now, there's several reasons for this. First of all, he's the first son that was born of Rachel, and Rachel was really the first love of Jacob. She's the one that he wanted to marry and got tricked into marrying Leah, and kind of started the whole evolution of the problem from there. So he's the first son. So that's one reason he was loved Joseph more. A second indicates that a writer suggested that in that culture, a son that was born in an old age was favored because having a son in an older age was a sign of a man's masculinity. So to some extent that may have been true. I think that's much lesser. Then the third factor was that Rebekah, Joseph's mother, had shown favoritism between Isaac and Esau. So this was kind of in the family of this favoritism showing from of one child over the other. So anyway, Jacob demonstrates his favoritism to Joseph by giving him what this version says, a long-sleeved robe. I think the King James Version says a coat of many colors. NIV refers to as an ornamented coat or robe. I think it's particularly interesting if you interpret it as a long-sleeved robe, because one writer indicated that men in that time, if they worked in the fields, they would not worn a long sleeve. It would have been a shorter type jacket that they would work that would not restrict their arms and legs. So having this long sleeve robe would have been more indicative of someone that did not work out in the fields, that had a more superior position, and would have been a more favored position. Nevertheless, whether it's just because it's long sleeve or it's multicolored or ornamented, it's very obvious that this robe was different from what that Jacob gave his other sons. But then in verse 4, it says they hated him. Now that's a very strong emotion. Now I think here is a real precaution to. If you have more than one child, not to show favoritism. That's one advantage of us, Kathy and me, just having one child. We didn't have to worry about favoring one over the other. But this favoring one over the other causes resentment, and I really suspect that this emotion that they hated him wasn't just the coat. It was probably a series of small things that where Jacob had over time had either very outwardly or kind of behind the scenes had indicated that Joseph was his favorite. And this caused a great resentment. And to the point that it says that they could not speak to him peacefully. This was not a happy home when the siblings had this kind of resentment toward each other. Now, verse 5 indicates that Joseph had a dream, and when he told him the dream, they hated him even more. Now, verses 6 and 7 is not in our text, but it talks about this. It says, he said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaves rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to him." And so, verse 8, his brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So this is the third time it refers to them hating him. Now, it's curious, why did, obviously Joseph had this dream, and as we know, that dream ends up becoming true, but is it a personality fault that he ended up sharing the dream with his son, with his brothers? Certainly, that caused more resentment. And you go on in verse 9, it says he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen, I had another dream. This time the sun and the moon were bowing. The sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him, saying, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. You know, it's when I read this, but his father kept it in mind. It reminded me of, you remember Mary, after Jesus was born, she pondered these things. And I kind of think that may be the same type of thought pattern is going through here with Jacob of keeping these in mind. So this pitfall came at no fault of Joseph. Certainly he was fully justified in bringing this bad report about his brothers. We don't know, we don't know the nature of that report, but he brought this bad report. Secondly, the text indicates that there's no indication that Joseph asked for or somehow prompted his father to give him this beautiful robe, which kind of caused more resentment. And then thirdly is the text does not reveal the tone of Joseph sharing these dreams. Knowing the whole life of Joseph, I really don't see Joseph saying this in a mocking way. I think he has such an innocence about him. He just simply said, "I had this dream," and maybe didn't really fully understand what the dream meant, but his brothers and his father did. So for people who've experienced this seemingly random events, it's often it's very easy to feel feelings of betrayal. We should always take courage that God knows our situation and is working in it and through it. On page 98, I thought it was interesting is there's two obvious flaws that the writer suggested that Jacob had. One, this widespread acceptance of polygamy. Now, we don't talk about it a lot in this before this, but polygamy was a accepted culture at that time. But certainly, polygamy would give rise to family dysfunction, as it did here. And the second thing they point out is this blatant favoritism that becomes toxic to this dysfunctional situation and causes everything to erupt. So in this situation we have two venomous poisons, that is animosity and jealousy, that turns level-headed family members into dangerous, vindictive adversaries, and this is what happens. Well, we go on. Sometime later, Israel, that is Jacob, sends Joseph to check on the welfare of his brothers. They are pasturing flocks at Shechem, which is probably 50 miles north of Hebron. And then he arrives at Shechem and finds out his brothers had moved the flocks over to Dothan, which is another 13, 15 miles, and he goes over there. So he's going, 60, 70 miles. What's curious to me is that Joseph is two things. One, he's apparently traveling, obviously walking, but he's walking these 60, 70 miles by himself, unguarded. And this is somewhat dangerous. That it's kind of curious that Jacob would send him there alone without someone going with him. And then the second thing is that I had a second thing in my mind, and it's just escaped me. He's traveling alone, and there's and he's wearing this coat, which the special coat would have kind of caused him to be more obvious, more kind of standing out, and even more likely to be a victim. So these are two situations I just think is kind of interesting. In verse 18, right before our text starts back, says, "But they," that is Joseph's brothers, "saw him in the distance, and before they reached him, they plotted to kill him." Now, this plotting to kill, that's premeditated murder. And that really tells you, indicates the degree of their hate, that they, some children sometimes will say, I hate you, and they really don't mean it. But I think this is, this aspect of this premeditated, there was strong animosity that they had toward Joseph. Then verse 19, it says, then they said to one another, that is, the brothers said to one another, oh, look, here comes that dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him, then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, let's not take his life. Reuben also said to them, don't shed blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the robe of many colors that he had on. Then they took him, threw him into the pit. The pit was empty without water. So we see, they started acting on, at first they just said, let's kill him. Here they said they are actually taking action, and very likely would have gone on and killed him when they first saw him, except that Reuben stands up for him. You remember, Reuben is the oldest son of Jacob, and he may have had some feeling the obligation to protect Joseph, one of his brothers, and also he also would have, if they'd killed him at that instant, gone back to Joseph, he would have been the one had to take more responsibility because he was the oldest son. So Reuben encourages him, don't shed blood. Let's throw him into this pit and just leave him in here into this pit that he cannot climb out of. And it also indicates that Reuben had the idea that, since basically he's bargained for time, and then he would go back and rescue Joseph. It appears that Reuben shared in the animosity toward Joseph. However, he did not want to take part in the murdering of the brother. So Joseph comes to his brother. They strip off his clothes, his robe, throws him into this pit, which is empty without water. These pits are essentially a cistern that would hold water, and here it's probably, this incident likely occurred in the summer because the pit was empty and dry. So Joseph did not face the prospect of sinking into mud or muck or suffocating, but he did face the reality of having no water and being unable to escape. So Joseph may not, at this point, may have not considered that God was still with him, but we know that God was working through this situation. Page 102, it has Philippians 2, 3 through 5, which is really a good text to go along with. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not to his own interest, but to the interest of others. Adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus. Certainly the brothers, of course, they couldn't read Philippians 2, 3 through 5, but they didn't take on this type of attitude toward Joseph. Now, in verse 26, again, it's not in the text. It says, Joseph and his brothers, Judah said to his brothers, what will we get? Well, Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And the brothers agreed. Well, it's curious that there's if we read verse 35, as they sat down to the meal, they saw this caravan of Ishmaelites coming to Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So the brothers take on just a casual indifference toward Joseph. Notice what did they do? It says they sat down, there in verse 25, they sat down to eat their meal. Here they've just thrown their brother into this pit with the idea that they were going to just leave him there and he would die of starvation. And rather than kind of getting away from the situation, they sat down just as they normally would do of indifference and starts eating their meal. Then Judah pipes up, and it's very interesting for me to Judah. Judah, we know, ends up being the line of David, the line of Jesus. Judah takes on a little bit different role here than we'll see later on at the end of Joseph's life, when they're in Egypt, that Judah also stands up again. So Judah, I think, starts taking on a different characteristic that we'll see kind of why he ends up being this lineage. So Judah then says, what do we gain if we kill him and cover up his blood? And this idea of covering up his blood, that's the same idea of going all the way back to Cain and Abel. You recall Cain, God told him that his blood called out, that Cain was not able to cover up Abel's blood. So perhaps Judah was kind of thinking of acting somewhat out of fear of God's possible punishment. But he says, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Now, Ishmaelites, these are the descendants of Ishmael. Ishmael is that first son of Abraham by Hagar, you recall from our previous lessons. So the Ishmaelites are related to Judah. So these are not first or second cousins. It may be a little bit more farther distance, but they are basically cousins. And the idea here is that Judah didn't want to kill him, but he had no problem, and he didn't want to kill him. He didn't want to leave him there to die, but he had no problem with selling him into slavery. So that's kind of a curiosity. It says, and he comes back to this, some sense of a relationship. He's our brother, our own flesh. So there is some, even though they're talking about hate, there is some degree of feeling underneath that. Well, in verses 29 through 35, I won't read them, but they end up selling Joseph to the Ishmaelites. They leave. Reuben comes back. Reuben finds that Joseph is not there. He's all distressed. And then verses 31, they take this robe and tear it and dip it in blood. And verse 32, they return to Jacob. In verses 33 through 35, Jacob mourns, very heartfelt mourning over this loss of his son. He was convinced that when he saw this robe, which is obviously Joseph's robe, it was covered in blood, that a wild animal had killed him, and that was all that was left of Joseph. Now let me read the last verse of chapter 37. Meanwhile, the Midianites, that's the Ishmaelites, sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officers, the captain of the guard. And that sets us up from what we'll be looking at next week, when again Joseph gets betrayed. And you probably are familiar with that story, but we'll look at it in more detail next week. Well, obviously the brothers profited from this sale. They got the 20 pieces of silver. Joseph lost all that mattered to him. He lost his robe, he lost his identity, he lost his family, and he lost his freedom. So this was a devastating time, and certainly for Joseph, it could have been a time when he could have just said, all is lost, and perhaps even thought of suicide or some other way to get rid of himself. But even though he didn't have Romans 8:28 available to him, I think he had that sense, God gave him that sense, that even that God was with him, had been with him, and would continue to be with him. And even though things looked horrible, it would all work, all things, even the very bad things, would work for good. We have that same promise today, and what a wonderful scripture Romans 8:28 is, but also I think these are wonderful scriptures that simply demonstrate that that's actually true. Okay, well, next week, as I said, we'll look at Joseph in Egypt and the situation with Potiphar's wife. So with that, I hope that, I'm hoping weather will clear. We're having difficulty getting together with our regular type schedules, but if the weather is good and if you're able, we certainly hope that you can join us on Sunday for Sunday school and for worship. Let me close this with prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for who you are. We thank you that you work in our lives, even when things seems all out of kilter, when things seems to be going against us. We know that you're still there, and that you, even though we may not understand it, that you do work all things for good. And we thank you for this story of Joseph. Help us to remember it as we have any type of sense of betrayal in our lives. Lord, we ask you to be with us, be with all that we do. May everything we do bring honor and glory to you. We ask these things in your name. Amen.